voice out of the way. Okay. Well, we finished up Joel last week, and which was a good, brief, quick study. Amos will be relatively quick too. It's only 9 chapters in length, and if you look at it verse by verse, I think they're even smaller than some of the chapters that we saw in Hosea and Joel. So while we won't get very far today, other than talking about introduction and maybe a few verses, Amos is going to be somewhat interesting. There are some variations between the studies of Joel and Hosea, so I think we'll find some new material and some quick material and some things to really consider. We start out talking about the sources. Of course, our Bible is our number one source, but sometimes there's a lot of things that still need to be filled in when we read the Bible so that we can understand some of those scriptures. So toward that, I've been following the early minor prophets by the Amazing Collection. As you know, I do a lot of reading and listening to Chuck Missler. One of his books, Prophets of the Northern Kingdom. There's a Minor Prophets podcast by Cornerstone Chapel. It's pretty good. And then, of course, David Guzik does a pretty excellent job of things with his Enduring Word commentary. But I do notice sometimes he leaves a few gaps in some of the areas too. So, and then there's many others. I mean, you just do a search on the internet and you'll find more information than you'll ever need to study this stuff. And even the stuff you do read will probably only be about 1% of what's out there. The authorship of Amos, there's no disputing it amongst commentators and everything. All records indicate that Amos is the author. Talk a little bit more later on, but Amos was one of the first ones that actually seemed like he did his writing or his drafting as he was delivering his messages and stuff. And so we'll talk about that a little bit. Even though he's the third of the 12 minor prophets, from a timeline, he was one of the earlier ones. He actually prophesied at about the same time as Hosea, if not a little bit before. So we'll talk about that. But the dating of this book is pretty easy because it, like Hosea, it specifically mentions only one king of Judah and one king of Israel. So that really kind of narrows it down. And then there's also some references to personal events or the great earthquake. This must have been a great earthquake because it's mentioned in a few other books of the Bible as well too. So, it's kind of like tornadoes. Nobody remembers the F1 tornadoes that go through, but but everybody talks about the F5 and can tell you exactly what year it was and where they were at when it occurred. So this earthquake must have been one of those events. Amos does go about revealing a little bit about himself. It's not just in the first sentence or first verse. There's a few other places throughout the book that talks about it as well. But Amos tells you what he is, what he does. He tells you what he's not, and we'll talk about that. Well, he tells you where he's from, and he tells you where he is not from. So a little play on words here, but we'll get into that as we get into those verses. One of the interesting things about Amos, though, is he didn't just step outside of his door and go to the town hall. He did not prophesy in his own land or to his own people. He was a traveling prophet. We always talk about what people's names mean, and so you have to think that Amos's parents were either prophetic or they were cruel, because they named him, his name means burden or burden bearer. So interesting that that name was given to him. So a lot of people comment that probably because he was carrying a heavy burden on behalf of the Lord to the people. So Again, a very prophetic name.
Really,
This is the only book of the Bible that. Go ahead.
I think it's worth noting also that he wasn't actually a prophet, not by
Right.
not by his education. He was not a prophet. He was called by God.
Yeah. And that's what the things that say what he is not and where he is not from.
Yeah.
Later on, I think it's in chapter 7, he gets in a dispute with somebody and he says, look, I'm not a prophet. I'm not a prophet's son. I didn't go to prophet school, but God tapped me on the shoulder and told me to come up here and talk to you. So, yeah, you're right. He's just a humble person that God called on. So
that's one other thing.
Otherwise,
one other point I'd like to make about that is that he wasn't necessarily educated. In other words, to put that into today's world, well, our church, as an example, seems like all the pastors are educated in theological schools, where we might be leaving a lot of people out that have a real good understanding of the Lord, and they are kind of glossed over simply because they don't have the education.
right.
And that's probably true with every church.
Yeah, and a lot of people are just introverts and are humble and that kind of stuff, and they won't put themselves out there, even though they may be the smartest person in the room.
Right.
So
Exactly.
You'll see a lot of that. Back to note 8 here. The book of Amos is the only place that Amos is mentioned. They don't specifically mention him in Kings or Chronicles. And like some of the prophets, they were mentioned in the New Testament by some of the apostles and things like that, but Amos is not mentioned anywhere else. There is some confusion that possibly Amos is oftentimes misinterpreted as possibly being Isaiah's father, whose name was pronounced the same way, but it was spelled Amoz, Amos. But that's not the same person. But from a time frame, it could have made sense, but nobody's found any actual factual linkages and that kind of stuff.
Again.
Moving on. Go ahead.
Hey, in the book, it's on the sideline. It said that Amos was mentioned in the New Testament 4 times. Maybe he was quoted in the New Testament. Yeah, but in that little book we have.
Yeah. On the side, little notes.
So homework for next week. I can try to find it.
Yeah, I'd have to find where though, because all the commentators and everything, and even my study Bible said this is the only place where Amos is mentioned.
Well, so, Mike's going to get the book. Do you remember it too?
I read it, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So it's like one of those sidebars.
It was there, that's true.
No, I believe you now. Now I do know that the earthquake is mentioned a few times and possibly some other events, but
on page 77, Ken, on the sidebar, it says Amos is quoted 4 times in the New Testament.
But it doesn't tell us where that is.
No.
Okay, well that's your homework assignment for extra credit.
Got it.
We'll all be checking that.
I read 6 commentaries and 5 of them says he's not mentioned. So anyway,
Logan, thanks for homework. He's got the 4 places.
Okay. Yeah, Logan's probably the only one that's got time to do it anyway. So
he's already done. He said
he looked it up on his phone. He's too quick on his phone. So what does it say?
So what do you find out?
It's Acts 9:36, 10:4, 10:31, and 24:17.
All in Acts.
All in Acts.
Acts 9, what is it, 36?
Okay, Mike's looking it up. Acts 9:36.
Could be wrong.
I'm a little slower than Logan.
Did you hear him? He's a little slower than Logan.
Now in Joppa, there was a disciple named Tabitha, which translated means Dorcas. She was completely occupied with good deeds and almsgiving.
No, yeah, so
That's it.
Incorrect.
That's incorrect.
Yeah, so my source was incorrect.
Oh, okay.
Okay, we'll work on that
Yeah,
for
we'll
next
work.
week.
That's why we call this homework.
Got it.
Okay. Well, back to the timeline. Now, preparing for Amos, I did kind of discover a little bit of an error here on my timeline. According to this timeline, Amos happens after Hosea. And actually, I take it back. In mine, it looks like it occurs right about the same time. Amos, and that's just because the distance on these are so small. But Amos actually occurred about 10 to 15 years before Hosea. The one for Joel in the southern kingdom may still be right. I do know that in all my research, Obadiah is probably the very first of the minor prophets, but because I originally had been kind of mentioned that maybe Amos was going up there to help Hosea and stuff, but everything looks like that he actually ended his prophecy before Hosea's even started. And we'll talk about maybe why that might have happened as well too. This is the same map that we've looked at before that kind of shows the divided kingdom. As I mentioned, Amos was from Tekoa, which was about 10 miles south of Bethlehem and about 20 miles south of Jerusalem. And he didn't prophesy in Judah, but he actually went north about 30 so miles or whatever to Bethel. And one thing I've noticed too, and I might have a bullet on this later, my study Bible says that he prophesied against Samaria, but everywhere that you read or all your linkages say that he was in Bethel. So I guess you could be setting in Bethel and prophesy against Samaria. It's probably no different than us setting in Parkersburg and preaching against Washington, D.C., I guess, which is the capital. But you will find some confusing possible verbiage and stuff in some of your studies. But Bethel is the place where Amos kind of gets into it with a priest and everything. So I'm going with Bethel because the majority of the commentators and everything say he was in Bethel. His ministry, Amos was one of the 2 of the 16 writing prophets who ministered to the northern kingdom prior to the exile. There'll be some more prophets probably when we do the second round of minor prophets that actually prophesied after the Babylonian, or I'm sorry, and the Assyrian exile for the northern kingdom. But a lot of the people agree that his prophecies he was very short. It wasn't, I mean, if you remember, I think it was Hosea, he had about a 40-year ministry. They don't really say about when Amos started, but it is believed that he was by 765 BC, he was pretty much done and concluded. As I mentioned earlier, he was denounced by the head priest Amaziah, who was one of the head priests that reported to King Jeroboam II. Amaziah was trying to get Amos to leave the northern kingdom. And because of that, he didn't get to bring his message to everyone. So instead, he worked. There's questions about whether he wrote it himself or he used a scribe. But no matter what, as we've always learned, that these are God-breathed scriptures. So these are God's words that are imparted to them. But a lot of the commentators said that because Amos was the first of the prophets to immediately, a lot of the prophets would go out and do their thing, and then they would later write these things down or write the book later on in life. But it seems like, Amos was a good note taker, so to speak, and his was almost done in real time. And there was a lot of commentators that said back then everybody admired the purity of his language and the beauty of his diction and his poetic art. And you hear these things and you say, well, yeah, but we're using a Hebrew language, which is very limited. So apparently, though, he got a lot of kudos for his writing skills and his different things. So before we get too far into it, I do have one bit of a challenging question, and without completely getting into all of the scriptures and all the chapters, just in chapter 1 and chapter 2 alone, we learn a lot, about at least the setup. We are told about some obvious punishments in the beginning, and then there was a mention of at least one not so obvious punishment that was kind of nestled or buried in the scripture. And so I wanted to see if anybody caught that. Later on, as we get deeper into some of the later chapters, we'll hear about some other not so obvious punishments. But can you name the obvious and the not so obvious punishments that was in chapter 1 alone?
No.
Yes.
I thought
David
fire was fire not one of the punishments?
Yeah.
Fire is the obvious punishment, because
Okay, yeah.
this
But then-
city, you did this, I'm going to give you fire. I mean, that's repeated every
Right.
one of them, I think, gets fire.
Right.
But
He
what
also
was something else? Go ahead.
he also managed breaking down the gate bar of Damascus, which I did a little bit of
Right.
checking on that, and it was talking about, I think it's cutting them off from their centers of pleasure.
Right.
That's what I cut out of that.
And I think in some of those verses, when he's calling out each individual city or region, to me, everything that God mentions after their iniquity was kind of an obvious punishment.
Yeah.
Where I'm going with this is a natural disaster. The earthquake. The earthquake could have been a not so obvious punishment that might have happened. Because just like the locusts or a drought or whatever, this could have been something that was caused by God that doesn't really specifically say that God did it, but that easily could have been a punishment as well. Now, these punishments here, whether it's the fire or the death and being struck down by the sword or even the earthquake, how do these punishments vary from the punishments that we saw or read about in, let's say, Joel?
In Joel, they talked about the locusts and the drought, starvation, that kind of thing.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Those punishments were what I kind of think were spread out over time, that there was more suffering involved, where the fire and the earthquake and some of these things was what I call swift retribution. I mean, they were immediate, and there might still be some suffering afterwards, but the majority of the punishment and the pain was experienced right then. And so when you deal with things like locusts and drought and things like that, where it's over time, sometimes sometimes you don't realize that you're being punished. But when a fireball comes out of the sky and burns your whole city, you know right then that this is different than yesterday. So that's where I was going. So did you gather anything there, David?
Thank you very much.
My thought on that is that the fires were destroying more of their buildings and fortresses instead of starvation and drought and that sort of thing.
Right. Yeah, because every one of those, it says like the fire will come down on the city or within the walls and things like that. And you got to think about the way buildings were built back then. Probably the only thing that was even capable of being burned was probably the roof part of the structures and maybe some of the doors and that kind of stuff. But yeah, you're right. The earthquake, of course, could have just completely destroyed buildings and things because obviously they didn't have any building codes or rebar back then. Yep. But yeah, I think when you compare, a fire destroying a town versus, like we said, a drought, which sometimes takes a whole entire year before you completely realize the outcome of it. It may be easy to overlook that was God's doing, so to speak. But the fireball, yeah.
Yeah, is there an earthquake or a volcano over there that may be raining down fire on all these places? I don't know. How did fire consume these places?
Yeah, Vesuvius is in the region. Of course, it's on the edge of the Mediterranean. It's not quite in, but that area is known to have had earthquakes pretty regularly and frequently. I even have found some evidence that maybe an earthquake actually caused a large side of a hill or a mountain to fall into the Jordan River and block it. And so some have made the connection that will maybe when the Jordan River got stopped up, or even at the time of Moses, that even though that was an act of God, that God could have blocked the river, kind of similar of that. So, but as far as volcanoes, I'm not sure what other volcanoes there are in that area without doing some research. But
Okay,
anyway.
a lot of fire. I just didn't know how earthquake would cause fire.
Yeah. Well, sometimes fire from the sky is thought to be a reference to lightning as well too. That lightning comes down out of the sky and sets things on fire and that kind of stuff. So never know. There are some common.
They don't have the power grid that we have now. That when earthquakes happen, fire, transformers blow. And
Yep. Yeah, there's some commentators that talk about in Revelation and stuff where it talks about that there will be fire from the sky and stuff. There's some that have made the connection that nuclear war could be considered fire from the sky as well too. It's just how you experience it and interpret it and that kind of stuff. And if you see a nuclear warhead land, you're only going to have a few milliseconds before you realize that it's over with anyway. But going on with the genealogy, I always show you this slide here, the genealogy of the kings. The era of Amos, 765 BC, the scriptures specifically mention Jeroboam II and Uzziah. So it's not hard to pinpoint this one. If you remember, Hosea's mentioned as many as 4 kings on one and one for the other. But because Amos's era is so small and compact, he only mentions these 2 kings. And we'll be talking a lot more about the lineage of the kings and how some of this nation split in the first place anyway. Amos's message. Amos doesn't just prophesy to one nation or whatever. He pretty much prophesies to everyone. both Hebrew nations as well as the surrounding Gentile nations. So he doesn't limit it to just one. It's more of a hub and spoke, where he kind of tells everybody what they did wrong. When we get through and get into some of his scriptures, he's going to talk a lot about the increased disparity between the very wealthy and the very poor. There might be some linkages and some thoughts about this is very applicable to today. But we'll talk about that as well. Amos provides at least 3 sermons to the Israel people. The first sermon addresses their past, present, and future sins. The second warns of some minor judgments to try to cause repentance. And then the third sermon basically tells Israel that her fate is sealed, severe judgment's coming. So in other words, it's too late. You've had your chances. This is what's going to happen to you. Amos also includes, he shares 5 visions regarding God's judgment. And he also shares 5 promises of hope from God that they will experience. So just know that there's a light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak. So even though that you've sinned and you're going to be punished, just know that there's something better ahead to look forward to. So I kind of wanted to set the scene here. We talked previously about how, and because we haven't studied Kings and Chronicles yet, but we kind of talked about how the kingdom split more than once. You know, there was one split with David when David became king, and Saul and Ishbosheth and whatever was Saul's son, how the kingdom split once, but then it came back together. And then after Solomon died, it split again. So I kind of wanted to give you a little bit of a detail on that, because what kind of happened with that split is part of the reason why God is so upset with people. So Solomon's son Rehoboam, when Solomon died, Rehoboam took over, and Rehoboam apparently wasn't as smart as his dad. And Solomon wasn't perfect, don't get me wrong. But Solomon had imparted a hefty tax burden, and depending on which Bible scriptures you read, some of them say that I'm under the yoke of Solomon, and he's put a heavy burden on our yoke and things. So a lot of people immediately think about, well, okay, he's treating them like slaves and he's making them work. But what was really going on here was he was charging them pretty hefty tax, and a percentage of all that they did had to go to the king. And of course, he then used it to build the temple in Jerusalem and so on. But when he died, the people reached out to Jeroboam the first and said, hey, we would like for you to represent us, and we would like for you to go talk to Rehoboam and see if he can give us a break on our taxes. So they petitioned Rehoboam to ease up and not take so much of their hard-earned labors and everything. And so Rehoboam sent them away, said, go away for 3 days, and when you come back, I'll give you my answer. Well, during those 3 days, he went and talked to his advisors. And like most lineages of kings, the elders that advised Solomon were also the same elders or advisors to Rehoboam. So he goes to those elders and asks them, well, what do you think? Should I ease up on these tax burdens? And the elders told Rehoboam, they said, if you will listen to them and give in to them, and give them a break, they will worship you forever. And so the elders agreed with the people and told Rehoboam that you should try to be an honorable king or whatever and give in to your people. Rehoboam then goes and he has all these younger advisors, which, you know, that's kind of all you got to do is read the headlines today. our president definitely has nothing but younger advisors and friends and everybody that he goes and gets his advice from. But Rehoboam goes to his younger friends and says, what do you think? And they said, no, Rehoboam, you shouldn't give in. You should increase their taxes and don't give in. You're going to be showing weakness and everything else. So when Jeroboam comes back to Rehoboam, they ask, and Rehoboam says, no, not only am I not going to lower your taxes, I'm going to increase your taxes. I'm a bigger man than my father was and everything, and I'm going to rule you even harsher. You know, he more or less says, I'm going to crack the whip, and he's going to rule with fear, more or less. So because that didn't go so well, this was what created the second split of the Israelite nation. And so 10 of the tribes revolted. They split off from the two tribes down south, which became Judah, and they made Jeroboam the first their king or their ruler over the northern nation. And so what you remember is, and we saw this in the New Testament and everything else, but even in the Old Testament, everyone would travel to Jerusalem to go to temple and worship the Lord. I mean, that was the center of where everybody worshiped. So here now you got Jeroboam that's up in northern kingdom, and on a regular basis and at least once a year, all of his people are migrating or going down to Jerusalem and to worship. So try to think about Parkersburg or whatever, that everybody leaves and goes to Charleston to go to church, and they're taking with them their money, their resources, their animals to sacrifice, and things like that. And they're taking it down and leaving it with the church, or spending their money in another country or in another town. So Jeroboam, and also too, you have to remember, we talked about this before, that all of the Levites that truly believed in the Lord and in the law and everything, they all migrated and went to Jerusalem and to Judah as well. So Jeroboam didn't have all of these truly religious priests and things like that in his area, and all of his people were going south. So he kind of saw it as his wealth and his resources were going somewhere else. So he then, in order to find a way to keep them home and keep the money in his kingdom, he creates two new temples at the cities of Dan and Bethel, and they are on the northern and southern extremes of the northern kingdom. You know, Bethel, as you saw on that map, was just right across the border from Jerusalem. And then Dan was at the very far extreme limits of the northern kingdom to the north. And it was Jeroboam the first that created golden calves at each one of these temples. And he tells the people, you don't have to go to Judah anymore. You can stay here and worship. And so this is the area. And we talked earlier, I think during some of the other ones, that it was the northern kingdom that kind of fell into a lot of the idolatry and things, because they were influenced by the Moabites and the Midianites and things like that. So these temples slowly over time went from worshiping the Lord more to worshiping golden calves and false idols and everything else. And this goes on for about a century and a half. The morals of the people are starting to deteriorate. The temples turn to idol worship. And so he said, you recall that Hosea prophesied earlier, or actually a little bit later, this was one of the errors I had in here, at or either after or about the same time in Samaria. But God can kind of see this is going on. And remember, God wasn't as harsh on Judah at first, because they were at least repenting from time to time and trying to follow the Lord. But the northern kingdom is just falling into more and more just poor morals and ethics and everything. So God then calls on a humble man, being Amos, and he asks him to go north and prophesy. And like we said, he's probably in Bethel, but he's prophesying against Samaria, which is the kingdom where Jeroboam and everybody were ruling from. So depending on which one you read, it could have been either or both. So starting now to get into some of the scriptures, still got a few minutes. Verse 1 in chapter 1 describes Amos as a sheep breeder. Some versions of the Bible say a sheep raiser. There's a lot of different versions about, what does Amos really do? But it mentions he's from Tekoa. That part is pretty narrowed down and factual. Tekoa actually is still around today in the Middle East. So you can pinpoint it on Google Earth, and with a little bit of few extra clicks, you can find it. It is about 8 to 10 miles south of Bethlehem. But I went back and looked at some of the Hebrew text, and one of the phrases they used was that Amos was among the herdsmen of Tekoa. So depending on how you get into this, for the shepherds themselves usually were poor people that were hired to take care of animals for other people. Some believe that Amos may have been a very poor man, being no more than a laborer who did tend to livestock and worked in orchards. And we learn later on in some of the later chapters that he was also a fig picker, or he tended to the sycamore fruits and things. We'll talk more about that later, but he could have been, a well-off man that just liked to do his own work for want of a better. So the phrase, if you believe in the phrase, he's among the herdsmen, or that he was a sheep breeder, you could get to the place where you think that maybe he's more like Job, that he owned a lot of livestock and everything, and he might have been in the middle to upper middle class of the people. We also talked about Tekoa. The verses clearly say where he's from. We can pinpoint that on a map. There's a reference to the 2 kings in the earthquake, like we said, that can play a big role in dating this prophecy. Those are right in verse 1 as well. And a little bit of research believe that this earthquake might have also been the same event that's mentioned in Zechariah and Ezekiel as many as 2 centuries later when they did their prophecies. As we talked about, my Bible says that the prophecy was against Samaria, which is not necessarily pinpointing a location, but all other commentaries and even some of the scripture kind of makes it sound like Amos does go to Bethel to do his thing. So I did a little bit of a blow up on this map just so you can kind of see it again. It's not a huge trek to go from Tekoa to Bethel. You could probably do it in one day by donkey, or however he might have. I mean, if he's got animals, he's probably got a donkey or something to ride on. And but again, Bethel's not that far across the border. And then you can kind of see Samaria there, which is a little more centrally located. But that's one of the main differences is with Amos, is that he was a traveling prophet. Okay, verse 2 then goes on to kind of clearly show that, God's not happy. Depending on how much emphasis you put on the words, and different Bibles have this scripture differently, but more or less it says the Lord roars from Zion and his voice is from Jerusalem. Some Bible versions say his voice thunders, or so there's they're trying to put the emphasis on, God's talking in his grown up loud voice and stuff. And it's making it sound like God is in Jerusalem looking up to the north and seeing what he's seeing, and all references to Zion is pretty much same as saying Jerusalem. I mean, there might have been a Mount Zion, or there was a Mount Zion in that area, but sometimes the word Zion can be a synonym for the entire nation. But in this particular scripture, it's kind of making it sound like God's sitting on top of his throne in Jerusalem, and he's shouting. The scriptures then go on to say the moaning of the pastures. We kind of talked about that a little bit last with Joel, that perhaps the animals were moaning or lowing because maybe they expect something bad to come, whether it's a drought, a plague, or even a conquering army. When you hear the Lord raise his voice, you know that there's a possibility that there might be something coming that's not going to be good for me and my career. There's also a reference that when God speaks so loud that Mount Carmel withers. The commentators don't all agree on where this Mount Carmel is. Some believe that there were two Mount Carmels, that there was one closer to Kahoa. However, if you go try to map it out or search for it on the internet, there are some very clear, plain references that there is a Mount Carmel that is located near the Mediterranean coast, west of the Sea of Galilee, and it's about 68 miles away. So if they are talking about that Mount Carmel, the Lord's voice and shouting from Zion and Jerusalem was so loud that it made a mountain 68 miles away with her, then, that's could be talking again about the earthquake or a major storm. But no matter what, all of the commentators and everybody pretty much agree on one thing, and that's that God's angry. He's not happy with the Northern Kingdom. And after 150 years of sitting there watching this slide into iniquity and everything, he's had enough. So then Amos spends the next 16 verses to describe the sins and the judgment on 6 Gentile cities and nations. And it's going to be interesting how this all develops and stuff, because he goes up there, he goes to the Northern Kingdom, and he doesn't immediately start in on them. He goes up there and he starts building a case, which is a little bit different. Most prophets go up on the street corner and then they start pointing their fingers saying, you messed up and you messed up and you're doing this, and because of that, this is what's going to happen. Instead, he goes up there and starts preaching or prophesying what's going to happen to all the people around the Northern Kingdom that have done them wrong. So he's kind of, I guess, setting a platform to kind of get them to believe what he's going to be saying and preaching. So I think it's interesting that he takes this approach. And, this is what we learn. And when you're writing letters or you're trying to sell something, you sell yourself first, and you try to build your case and build that trust first. So then perhaps what you say later on, whether it's good news or bad news, you start out with an opening statement. So and in all 6 of these cities and nations, they all start out kind of with the same expression. It says, for 3 transgressions, Damascus, and for 4. The meaning of that phrase is debated. Not everybody agrees what we're talking about here. One translation thinks that it could be translated as saying, for 3 crimes and for another 4, meaning a total of 7 crimes or iniquities. And the number 7, if you've done any number research of the Bible and stuff, the number 7 in Hebrew is the number for completion, or it's done, it's finished. So some have used that to say, yeah, he's talking about 7 crimes. They've finished it. Now it's time for judgment. We can't take anymore. Other translators have said, no, it's just for 3 crimes, but on the 4th one, that's it. I'm not taking anymore. But all the commentators more or less say, look, they're talking about sin upon sin upon sin upon sin. It doesn't really matter if it's 4 or 7, typo. But the phrase is meant to show that God's seen enough. He's not going to take it anymore. And get ready, because your whipping's coming. So as we go through each of these cities, I'll try to cover the pertinent parts of the verses and stuff, just because I think some of them are kind of interesting and they have some significance. Some of them are just kind of going on and on, but the truth of the matter is they're calling them out. They mention what their transgressions were, and then they mention what their punishment's going to be. And depending on the level of detail, some of them get a few additional judgments, and so we'll get along with that. So we'll get to a couple of them. The first one he calls out is Damascus. Now, it's interesting that the first 3 he calls out by a city, which I'm assuming is the capital, but they still, it's almost as if somebody says, I'm going to punish you, Washington, D.C. Well, if they punish Washington, D.C., now some of us might say, okay, they've got it coming, but they're punishing the nation, not just capital city. So whenever you hear or see Damascus, you need to think about Syria. And Syria is not to be confused with Assyria. Syria today is, where Lebanon and some of the other cities are. But the sin that was described for Damascus is that they have threshed Gilead with implements of iron. And again, several Bibles all say things differently. But the commentators would debate about whether or not this is a true description of what actually occurred. Some say, yeah, they took items from the threshing floor or tools with spikes and stuff, and they tortured and mutilated Israelites and things like that. Others actually say that it's more of a figure of speech, kind of like you drug a threshing sled across the nation of Israel and caused all this great damage. My first thought is that God doesn't always use figures of speech very often, because if you look at the first 6, 4 of them have very specific crimes or whatever of what they did. But there was one other one that might have sounded symbolic. So what it comes down to is it doesn't matter if it's a figure of speech or if they truly did torture people. We know the Assyrians tortured everybody, but nonetheless, it doesn't matter figure of speech or whatever. They've apparently done something to Gilead and the Israelite people that was so bad that here comes the punishment. And the punishment, again, the number one thing is, I'm going to send fire in the house of Haziel or Haziel. Now, you can find different information on, if you look up the word Haziel. Some say that every king that ever sat on a throne used the title Haziel or Ben Hadad. Some of the places I looked specifically said Haziel was a future king of Syria that doesn't happen until about 745 BC. So if it truly was, I'm going to send fire into the house of Haziel, God is prophesying here or making a prediction of a future king of Syria that hasn't even happened yet. And we find out later that it did indeed happen. So again, more evidence that maybe this prophecy really did come true. Ben Hadad, which means son of Hadad, He may have been the king at the time of the prophecy was given, but it says that the palaces of Ben-Hadad will be destroyed. So almost every one of these prophecies, it makes it sound like the rulers, not only is the city destroyed, but the palaces of the rulers are also destroyed. But the big thing is, it says the people of Syria will be taken captive, and they will all be taken to Kir. And you look up the word Kir and you'll find different places. So it doesn't really matter if it's in Moab or if it's in Iraq or wherever it is. But if we read back through 2 Kings chapter 16, the Assyrians did come into Assyria and take all their people captive and took them to Kir. So again, here's another prophecy that did indeed come true for Damascus. Somebody saying something, or is that background?
Stop.
Must be background. The
There you go.
second the second city that they talk about is Gaza. And Gaza, as we all know, is the strip along the coast, which then was the Philistines or Philistia. The sin described for Gaza is that the Philistines captured and enslaved whole populations. And you don't really realize that when you read the scripture, but the commentators can provide, a lot of detail. It says they took captive for the whole of captivity. What almost all of them agree with is what they meant is they were going in there and they were taking everybody captive. And to give you a little bit of a background, it was common practice that if you got into a battle with another army, anybody that survived on the losing side that didn't get mortally wounded or killed, it was common practice to take them captive and turn them into slaves as long as they were military men. And if you want to think about that, think about Russell Crowe in The Gladiator. He gets taken captive, even though he was like a general, in the Roman army or whatever. But what was not common was for people to go into communities and take whole populations of women and children and everything, and more or less like a slave run. And we know our country was built a little bit on the profits of people that made slave runs, but it was not common practice in the Middle East or it was not considered to be okay for to go make slave runs for commercial profit. Gaza didn't even need the slaves for themselves. They merely just went in, captured the slaves, and then they were taking them to eat them, to sell them. So that was their business plan. This is how we're going to make a living, is we're going to go capture Israelites and take them to eat them and sell them. So again, what's the punishment? Fire is brought down within the city walls. The palaces are destroyed. And it talks several times, it talks about how the inhabitants will be cut off, which they're more or less saying that the people in these towns and communities and stuff are going to be contained. But at the very end of this one, it specifically says that the remnants of Philistia or the Philistines, whoever's still remaining at the end of this, they're going to be killed. Or it says they will perish. So not a good thing, but obviously this could have been the event that wipes the Philistines from the face of the earth. He used the word remnant again, as if only a small portion of the Philistines will be remaining. And we learned, the remnants of Israel during Joel meant, a very small portion. So I did have a map here to share just so you could see. Damascus was in that orange area up there is the Syrian limits, more or less. Gaza was along the coast there in Philistia. The scriptures go on to even mention 3 other communities: Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Ekron by name. So that's where the first and second two judgments come from. So 10:05, it's about where I wanted to end. Next week, we'll continue on with, we'll finish up chapter 1, get into chapter 2 and chapter 3. Those will all go pretty quickly. If you do read your study guide, read pages 77 through 82. We'll wrap up the judgments on the nations, and then a bigger focus on the authority of the prophet's message and the punishment of Israel. You know, the first chapter, like we said, the first 16 verses or whatever are on the Gentile nations, and then there'll be a few on Judah. The rest of the book is all about Israel. So we'll talk more about Amos's plan of attack here. So with that, I will end. Does anybody have any questions or comments or anything you want to share?
Been trying to dig up Laura's question about where Amos was mentioned in other books, and I'm not coming across anything. So if somebody can find something, if you'll send it to me, I'll appreciate it.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. If you find anything, just hit reply all and share it with us, please.
Another good lesson. Thank
Okay.
you. Thank you.
Yep. Appreciate it. Okay, I'll stop recording.